Hello viewers, today let's discuss a very beautiful poem titled The Invitation, written by one of our famous Indian poets, Sri Aurobindo. The Invitation is a poem written by Sri Aurobindo during the years 1908 and 9 when he was in Alipur jail. It is an intense and uplifting collection of musings from a person who was a revolutionary fighting for the freedom of India, and at the same time he was an enlightened being. Here Sri Aurobindo gives voice to his own inner feelings by inventing a narrator, in fact a first-person narrator to be precise. To put the poem in a nutshell, the poet-narrator invites readers to attain an inner freedom that does not depend on any other beyond the self, and it is an invitation to embrace solitude and an invitation to experience free and peaceful existence. The poet gives an open invitation to anyone to go with him as he climbs up the hill to the moorland and the rough wind and the weather that was beating around him. He invites anyone to wade through the brook and tramp through the snow, because he dwells not in the petty circle of cities cramped by doors and walls, but where God exists in blue in the welkin. Though the wind and the storm rebel against him, he enjoys his solitude and made misadventure his friend. Therefore, he asks anyone to come and live with him freely in the wind-swept uplands. He is proud that he has the spirit of freedom and pride, and feels that he is the lord of tempest and mountain. And thus, one who joins him in his kingdom and walks by his side must be stark and a kinsman to danger. The Invitation was composed, as it was said, when he was in Alipur jail in the year 1908. Aurobindo calls his days in prison as a year's living in an ashram, or we can also call it as a hermitage. He describes attaining an inner freedom that does not depend on others, of embracing solitude and of tasting peace. The poem is better understood in the light of history. As readers, it becomes important that we contextualize the poem with the backdrop of the personal life of Sri Aurobindo and collective life of Indians in the bondage under the British rule. Sri Aurobindo had revelatory visions of Krishna when he was in Alipur jail, and instead of feeling jailed, he miraculously felt deep inner freedom and had the experience that the divine is manifest in one and all. It would not be wrong to say that this period was a turning point in Sri Aurobindo's life, and his life as a seer gradually unfurled to bloom after this testing time in prison. So after this brief background to the poem, it's time to know a little about the poet himself. Sri Aurobindo ranks among the greatest personalities of modern India. He is a multifaceted genius, a political revolutionary, social reformer, historian, educationist, philosopher, yogi, and above all, a man of letters. He is a journalist, editor, literary critic, linguist, translator, essayist, short story writer, dramatist, and more than all of these, a great poet. He falls into the exclusive category of poet-seers who have achieved the highest realizations and have endeavored to share that experience with the rest of humankind. The teaching and very utterances that spiritual masters of this caliber offer to the world come from the most sublime realms of consciousness that human beings can attain to. Their poetry transcends the page to become mantra, an invocation to the transcendental consciousness. Sri Aurobindo, Indian nationalist, poet, philosopher and spiritual guru, was born in Calcutta on 15th August 1872. Sri Aurobindo spent his formative years in England studying at St. Paul's and Trinity College, where he excelled in the study of literature and the classics. In 1892, he returned to India, where he became closely involved in the Indian independence movement. He was a natural leader and one of the most radical nationalist politicians. Because of his radicalism, in 1908, Sri Aurobindo was arrested on suspicion of being involved in a bomb plot and was remanded in Alipur jail. It was here in jail that Sri Aurobindo had significant spiritual experiences. He became aware of a divine inner guidance and also realized the omnipresence of God even in a darkened prison cell. Later, he was released without charge. However, this experience changed Sri Aurobindo's outlook. Henceforth, he retired from politics and focused his energies on spirituality. Sri Aurobindo travelled to Pondicherry, South India, where he could practice yoga undisturbed. In 1914, he was joined by a French woman, Mira Richards, who would later become known as the mother of Sri Aurobindo Ashram. Together, they founded Sri Aurobindo Ashram, which began to attract disciples drawn to their dynamic reinterpretation of yoga. His main works were The Life Divine, The Synthesis of Yoga, Essays on the Gita and Savitri. Savitri was an epic work of poetry that he worked on for over 20 years. Sri Aurobindo did not negate the world like Indian yogis of the past. Instead, Sri Aurobindo affirmed that all life is yoga. Through a conscious aspiration, it is possible for man to evolve into a higher consciousness, a consciousness of truth and inner harmony. Sri Aurobindo called this new consciousness the supramental. For over 40 years, Sri Aurobindo worked tirelessly for his vision of a divine life on earth. Through his writings and poetry, he left a legacy which reflected his hopes of a golden future for humanity. Sri Aurobindo entered Mahasamadhi on December 5th, 1950. This is about the poet. Now let's go to the poem. We will look into the meaning of the poem line by line. This is one of the Sri Aurobindo's short poems which can awaken one to the true love of poetry. The Invitation, written by Sri Aurobindo. With wind and the weather beating round me, up to the hill and the moorland I go. Who will come with me? Who will climb with me? Wade through the brook and tramp through the snow. Not in the petty circle of cities, cramped by your doors and your walls I dwell. Over me God is blue in the welkin. Against me the wind and the storm rebel. I sport with solitude here in my regions. Of misadventure have me a friend. Who would live largely? Who would live freely? Here to the windswept uplands ascend. I am the lord of tempest and mountain. I am the spirit of freedom and pride. Stuck must he be and a kinsman to danger, who shares my kingdom and walks at my side. So now let's go line by line and understand the meaning of the poem. This is one of the Sri Aurobindo's short poems which can awaken one to the true love of poetry. The poem is an invitation to experience the narrator's experience of freedom and largesse in existence. In the first stanza of Invitation, the poet speaks about a journey uphill. There are those geophysical words employed by the poet to describe the journey, but they sound English, which can be attributed to Sri Aurobindo's European residence and education. For instance, the word moorlands in the second line, which is indicative of the uncultivated countryside, and the idea of wade through the brook and tramp through the snow, that is the fourth line, create an English influence upon the Indian emotion of the upclimb. The poet wants others to be a party to the ascension and extends an invitation in verse when he says, "Who will come with me? Who will climb with me? Wade through the brook and tramp through the snow," as given in the third and the fourth lines. Also, here we'll just try to give our emphasis on one of the sounds produced here. In the above lines, "Who will come with me? Who will climb with me?" It is noteworthy that both of the action words or verbs in this line begin with the k sound. The first two stanzas are particularly loaded with a Wordsworthian sort of romanticism, a love for nature and the countryside, which are in stark contrast to the hustle bustle of city life. In this poem, Sri Aurobindo goes ahead to move us from the outer landscape to the inner nature and a state of desirable freedom. The poet narrator makes his carefree state of existence very clear by contrasting it with city life and its limitedness when he says, "Not in the petty circle of cities, cramped by your doors and your walls I dwell." The first two lines in the second stanza speak about those lines. The phrase petty circle of cities has a repetition of the sounds of t and s, and the phrase amounts to concluding that city life is binding and circular, or in other words, rather limited. The next line opens with the sea, and the poet says that he is beyond the cramped doors and walls. The sounds of d repeats in this line in the words doors and dwell. A note of distinction between the poet and the drabness of city life is made more obvious and emphatic when the poet narrator says, "your doors and your walls." He sees himself as distinct, and there is a sort of psychoanalytic otherness that the poet narrator establishes by emphasizing on the word "your." He describes his natural state of existence when he says, "Over me God is blue in the welkin, against me the wind and the storm rebel." Lines 3 and 4 in the second stanza. The choice of the literary word welkin for sky as being the abode of God literally transforms the setting of the poem from the mundane to the celestial spheres. Still further, there is an aura of mystery when the poet narrator says that he plays with solitude in his own region and that he has befriended misadventure in the first and second lines of third stanza. Perhaps he implies that to those who are trapped in the humdrum of life, his situation would translate to a misadventure. But for him, there is a largesse and freedom in his situation. Once again, there is a repetition as in the first stanza. If you go back to the first stanza, we can see that the third and fourth lines in the first stanza, and again in the third stanza, we have third and fourth lines, same kind of repetition. So once again, there is a repetition as in the first stanza. The poet further extends the invitation in the following lines by saying, "Who would live largely? Who would live freely? Here to the windswept uplands ascend." Perhaps the word windswept is indicative of certain calmness devoid of turmoil. Finally, the last stanza. The poet narrator reveals the prominent attributes of his entity and also enlists the essential prerequisites for those who wish to accept his invitation. He calls himself the Lord of the tempest and the mountain and says that he is the spirit of freedom and pride. The lines 1 and 2 in this last stanza. The persona that Sri Aurobindo creates is powerful and embodies the spirit of freedom and pride. Here, the spirit is personified with the capitalization of the letter S. The word pride in association with freedom should not be read in a derogatory manner, but rather as a dimension of self-respect. Pride is sinful in the English context, but here the narrator is perhaps trying to convey an Indian expression like Atma-Samman in the foreign language and has few words as equal substitutes. In the end, the poet says that the ones who accept the invitation must be stark and a kinsman to danger. In the last line, indicative of the strength required to accept the invitation and to ascend upwards to share the poet narrator's experience. After the meaning and form of the poem is discussed, let's discuss the structure and style of the poem. Because for any poem, this is the beautiful aspect that the poet deals with. In this poem, we can see that Sri Aurobindo is a skillful craftsman in the use of blank verse and felicity in poetic expression. His grand mantric and mystic style in his poetic works is ample testimony of his stupendous achievements. Throughout his life, Sri Aurobindo strove for a poetry which was loyal to the inherent and natural laws of meter, rhythm and rhyme, yet was not bound by them in any immutable or rigid way. Sri Aurobindo studied meter extensively and composed many poems that followed new and previously unexplored schemes of meter in the English language. He devised his own set of laws for the proper use and purpose of meter. In his sublime essay on quantitative meter, he exposes his theories, arguing that meter and poetic rhythm are not things to be caught in fixed, hard and fast rules of quantity, but should rather be subtle, flexible and willing to bend to the suggestions of the inner ear. He felt strongly that meter should serve the poetic inspiration by heightening and sublimating it, not vice versa by dictating and governing the poetic speech. Invitation is a short mystical poem in 4 lyrical stanzas with the rhyme scheme A, B, C, B. The atmosphere that the words create is dreamy, almost fairy tale-like and unfelt, unknown in reality or not wholly comprehensible to our own busy, self-absorbed, mechanical routine of life. The effect of this poem is that one can sense a calling or beckoning, and one knows that bright promises are inherent in the call. The reader knows that there are rewards for accepting the invitation. The mystical elements used in the poem can be understood if we understand Sri Aurobindo's elucidation in one of his letters with an illustration from his poetry, which needs to be essentially understood as one delves into the mysticism inherent in his poetry, which nonetheless speaks for itself. According to him, a mystic poem may explain itself or a general idea may emerge from it, but it is the vision that is important or what one can get from it by intuitive feeling, not the explanation or idea. Now, towards the end, let's try to critically appreciate the poem. The poem becomes relevant to each of us because we live in such suffocative cities where we don't tend to see the power of blowing wind. And even if, sometimes rarely, we don't feel like going out running when the weather is bad, particularly now since it is winter, but wild weather has a special kind of power which can be invigorating. Sri Chinmoy, a follower of Sri Aurobindo, commented that often children will get a lot of joy when the wind blows powerfully, and that the wind reminds us of the transient nature of life. We like to have everything ordered and comfortable, but the wind ruins our plans. Like the poem, it beckons us to a greater and more liberated experience of life. If we can stop clinging to comfort, then we can really enjoy ourselves. The poem also speaks about the wildness of life. Many a time we pass through such stormy winds of life, we start praying to God to let us escape them and ease our situation. Despite our best efforts, when nothing happens, we realize the true peace comes when we finally surrender to the situation, because God always knows what is best for us, even if our mind doesn't care for it. The betterment of the soul always takes precedence over the crying of the stupid mind. Finally, I would like to conclude, the message of the poem is absolutely true. The more difficult things get, the more we need to dive within and rely on God to carry us through. Adversity forces our eyes wide open, and it's absolutely true. It doesn't feel good at the time, but it forces us to call on our inner reserves, which will help us to expand ourselves.